The ancient ceiling fans of the Millbrook County Courthouse wheezed overhead, stirring the thick, August air that seemed to press down on everyone like a heavy blanket. The gallery was packed beyond capacity, townspeople squeezed into every available seat, some standing along the walls, all craning their necks to get a better look at the defendant's table. This wasn't just any trial. This was the case that had split their small town right down the middle. At the center of it all sat 17 Maya Rodriguez, her dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, wearing a navy blazer that looked borrowed from someone twice her size. She should have been intimidated by the sea of faces, by the weight of the charges against her, by the very real possibility that her life was about to be derailed before it had truly begun. Instead, she sat with an unnatural calm, her fingers moving methodically through a stack of manila folders, as if she were organizing homework rather than preparing to fight for her freedom. The charges were serious: reckless endangerment, obstruction of justice, and assault on a police officer, the kind of charges that could send a teenager to juvenile detention and destroy any hope of college, of a future beyond the borders of this suffocating small town. But Maya's expression remained serene, almost contemplative, as she reviewed documents with the precision of a seasoned attorney. Across the aisle, Officer Daniel Briggs lounged in the witness section with the casual arrogance of a man who had never lost a case. At 35, he was everything a small-town cop was supposed to be: tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of square jaw that looked good on recruitment posters. His uniform was perfectly pressed, his badge polished to a mirror shine, and his confidence was so thick you could cut it with a knife. But it was his partner that drew most people's attention. Beside Briggs sat the most magnificent German Shepherd anyone in Millbrook had ever seen. The dog's name was Kaiser, and he was as much a celebrity in town as any human. Black and tan coat that gleamed under the courtroom's fluorescent lights, ears sharp and alert, amber eyes that seemed to miss nothing. Kaiser had been responsible for more drug busts than any other canine in the county's history, and his reputation for accuracy was legendary. "This is going to be easier than I thought," Briggs murmured to his fellow officers, loud enough for the nearby reporters to hear. His laugh was rich with confidence, the sound of a man who had already mentally written his victory speech. "Kid thinks she can outmaneuver the system with a few legal books. Doesn't she know who she's up against?" The other officers chuckled along, but their laughter died abruptly when Maya looked up from her files. Her gaze swept across the prosecution's side of the courtroom with the cool assessment of a general surveying a battlefield. When her eyes met Briggs's, there was no fear, no uncertainty, no trace of the intimidated teenager everyone expected to see. Instead, there was something that made several spectators shift uncomfortably in their seats: a quiet confidence that seemed far too mature for someone who should have been worried about prom dates and college applications. But it was Kaiser's reaction that truly caught attention the moment Maya's gaze fell on him. The German Shepherd's ears perked forward, his head tilting slightly to one side in a gesture that dog lovers recognized as curiosity mixed with recognition. His tail, which had been resting motionless against the floor, gave the faintest twitch, barely perceptible, but there nonetheless. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Patricia Hawthorne," the bailiff announced, and the courtroom erupted in the shuffle of feet and rustling of clothing as everyone stood. Judge Hawthorne entered with the measured pace of someone who had presided over thousands of cases, her silver hair pinned back severely and her black robes flowing behind her like wings. As the preliminaries began, Maya remained focused on her notes, occasionally glancing up to observe the jury selection process with the intensity of a poker player reading her opponents. She had insisted on representing herself, despite the court's attempts to assign public defenders, a decision that had been met with everything from admiration to outright disbelief. A 17-year-old girl taking on the county's most decorated police officer. It seemed like legal suicide, but those who looked closely might have noticed subtle details that suggested this case was more complex than it appeared. Maya's folders were organized with military precision, each tab labeled in neat handwriting that betrayed a methodical mind. Her questions during jury selection were sophisticated, targeting potential biases with the skill of someone who had studied not just law but psychology, and every time she spoke, Kaiser's attention shifted to her with an intensity that his handler was beginning to find disturbing. "The state will prove beyond reasonable doubt," began District Attorney Richardson, his voice booming with theatrical authority, "that the defendant willfully endangered public safety, obstructed a lawful investigation, and assaulted Officer Briggs in the commission of his duties. This is not a case about teenage rebellion or misunderstanding. This is about a young woman who chose to place herself above the law." Richardson was a showman playing to the gallery with sweeping gestures and carefully modulated outrage. He painted a picture of Maya as a reckless teenager who had interfered with a legitimate drug bust, endangered innocent bystanders, and then physically attacked a police officer. When confronted with her crimes, it was a compelling narrative backed by the testimony of respected law enforcement officials and seemingly supported by physical evidence. But, as Richardson spoke, something strange happened. Kaiser, who should have been focused on his handler or resting in preparation for his own testimony, kept looking at Maya, not with the suspicious attention a police dog might give a potential threat, but with something that looked remarkably like expectation, as if he was waiting for her to do something, to reveal something, to prove something that only he understood. Maya, for her part, took careful notes throughout the opening statements, her pen moving steadily across legal pads with the efficiency of a court reporter. She didn't react to Richardson's accusations, didn't flinch when he described her actions in the harshest possible terms, didn't show any sign of the emotional breakdown that many expected from a teenager facing such serious charges. It came time for her opening statement. Maya rose slowly, smoothing down her oversized blazer with hands that didn't shake. She walked to the center of the courtroom with measured steps, her eyes sweeping across the jury with the confidence of someone who had already won half the battle. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, her voice clear and strong despite her age, "you have just heard a story about a reckless teenager who defied the law and attacked a police officer. It's a simple story, easy to understand, and it fits our assumptions about young people who don't know their place. But stories, even simple ones, can be misleading when they leave out crucial details." She paused, letting her words sink in, and in that moment of silence, Kaiser's tail wagged once, a single deliberate movement that his handler immediately tried to suppress by tightening the leash. Over the next few days, you will learn about those missing details. You will discover that things are not always what they seem, that truth has a way of hiding in plain sight, and that sometimes the most important witness in a case is the one who cannot speak for themselves. As she spoke, Maya's eyes found Kaiser, and for just a moment something passed between them, recognition and understanding, a shared knowledge that no one else in the courtroom could interpret. The German Shepherd's ears pricked forward, his amber eyes bright with an intelligence that seemed almost human. He asked, "Only that you listen carefully, observe closely, and remember that justice requires more than just accepting the most convenient explanation. Because in this case the truth is not just important, it's everything." As Maya returned to her seat, the courtroom buzzed with whispered conversations. Some spectators seemed impressed by her composure, others skeptical of her youth and inexperience. But everyone had noticed the strange behavior of the police dog, and more than one person wondered what it might mean. Officer Briggs tried to dismiss the dog's reactions, tugging sharply on the leash whenever Kaiser's attention wandered toward the defense table. But as the first day of testimony began, it became clear that something unprecedented was happening in the Millbrook County Courthouse. A teenage girl was about to take on the entire criminal justice system, armed with nothing but her intelligence, her determination, and the inexplicable support of a police dog who seemed to see something in her that everyone else had missed. The battle lines were drawn, the players were in position, and the first shots had been fired. But as the court recessed for lunch, Maya Rodriguez sat quietly at her table, organizing her files with the same methodical precision she had shown all morning. She looked like any other teenager, young, small, seemingly out of her depth, but Kaiser knew better, and as the German Shepherd was led from the courtroom, his eyes remained fixed on Maya until she disappeared from view. Whatever was about to unfold in this small-town courthouse, the most important judge might not be the one wearing robes. During the lunch recess, the courthouse emptied as lawyers, spectators, and court officials scattered to local restaurants and coffee shops to dissect the morning's proceedings. The summer heat had intensified, turning the courthouse steps into shimmering waves of asphalt and concrete that made the air dance like water. Most people sought air-conditioned refuge, but Maya Rodriguez chose a different path. She walked slowly around the side of the building to a small garden area that the county had installed years ago in an attempt to beautify the austere government complex. A few weathered benches sat beneath struggling oak trees, and a small fountain gurgled weakly in the center. It wasn't much, but it was quiet, and Maya needed a moment to think without the weight of hundreds of eyes pressing down on her. She had just settled onto one of the benches, spreading her legal papers across her lap, when she heard the familiar click of claws on pavement. Looking up, she saw Officer Briggs approaching with Kaiser at his side, the German Shepherd's head up and alert. As they made their way toward the courthouse's rear entrance, Maya kept her attention focused on her documents, but she was acutely aware of every step the pair took. As they drew closer, she could feel Briggs's eyes on her, probably assessing whether she was as nervous as he hoped she would be. But it was Kaiser's reaction that surprised everyone the moment the German Shepherd caught sight of Maya sitting alone on the bench. His entire demeanor changed. His ears shot forward, his tail began a subtle wag, and he pulled gently against the leash, not aggressively, but with the eager anticipation of a dog who had spotted a familiar friend. It was the same body language Kaiser typically reserved for Briggs himself or other members of his paquet buddy. Maya said softly, not looking up from her papers but clearly addressing the dog. Her voice carried the warm tone of someone comfortable around animals, natural and response was immediate and unmistakable. His tail wagged harder, and he took a half step toward the bench, his amber eyes bright with what could only be described as joy. It was the reaction of a working dog recognizing not just a friendly human, but someone who understood him on a deeper level and talked to him. Briggs snapped, jerking the leash sharply enough to make Kaiser's head snap back. His voice carried an edge of irritation, mixed with something that might have been uncertainty. A working police dog, not a pet. Maya finally looked up, meeting Briggs's hostile glare with calm indifference. I wasn't aware that saying hello was a legal, officer, she replied evenly, but I apologize if I overstepped. The exchange lasted only seconds, but several people witnessed it from the courthouse steps. What they saw was a teenage girl treating a police dog with casual familiarity, and a police dog responding as if he had been waiting for exactly that interaction. More disturbing for Briggs was the way Kaiser continued to look back at Maya as they walked away, his neck craning around, despite his handlers' increasingly firm commands to heel and focus. The afternoon session began with the prosecution calling its first witness off, Janet Morrison, Briggs's backup on the night in question. Morrison was a 15-year veteran with a reputation for thorough reports and unshakable testimony. As she took the witness stand, her uniform crisp and her bearing professional, it seemed like the prosecution was building an insurmountable case. Richardson lead Morrison through her testimony with practiced efficiency, establishing the timeline of events, the radio calls, and her observations upon arriving at the scene. According to her account, Maya had been interfering with a legitimate drug investigation, refusing to comply with lawful orders, and had ultimately struck Officer Briggs when he attempted to place her under arrest. But during cross-examination, Maya approached the witness stand with a different energy entirely. She moved with purpose, carrying a manila folder that she handled with the care of someone holding explosive material. Officer Morrison, Maya began, her voice carrying easily through the courtroom. Despite her youth, in your report, you state that you arrived on scene at approximately 11:47 p.m. Is that correct? Yes, that's correct. And you observed me allegedly striking Officer Briggs at that time. Morrison hesitated for just a fraction of a second, pause so brief that most people missed it, but Maya caught it like a hunter spotting movement in tall grass. Yes, I witnessed the assault. That's interesting, Maya said, opening her folder and withdrawing a document, because, according to the dispatch records which I've had independently verified, your unit didn't receive the backup request until 11:52 p.m. Would you like to explain how you witnessed events that occurred before you were even called to the scene? The courtroom erupted in murmurs. As Morrison's face flushed red, Richardson jumped to his feet with an objection, but the damage was already done. Maya had just caught a veteran police officer in a contradiction that suggested either sloppy police work or deliberate deception. It was during this tense exchange that the most significant moment of the day occurred. As Maya questioned Morrison, Kaiser sat beside the witness stand, where Briggs had positioned him. The German Shepherd should have been focused on potential threats, or simply resting in the familiar routine of courtroom procedure. Instead, his attention was completely fixed on Maya. Every time she moved, Kaiser's head tracked her movement. When she paused to check her notes, his ears pricked forward, as if he was listening intently to every word. Most remarkably, when Maya scored her point about the timeline discrepancy, Kaiser's tail wagged, a clear sign of approval that several jury members noticed. Judge Hawthorne certainly noticed, Officer Briggs, she said. During a brief recess, your canine seems unusually engaged. Today, is there something I should be aware of? Briggs looked down at Kaiser, who was sitting at perfect attention, but with his head turned toward Maya's table like a compass needle pointing north. He's just alert, Your Honor. It's nothing unusual, but was unusual, and everyone in the courtroom could see it. Police dogs were trained to remain calm and focused during proceedings, to ignore distractions and maintain their professional demeanor. Kaiser's obvious interest in Maya was so far outside normal behavior that it had become a distraction in itself. As the day wore on, the pattern continued. Whenever Maya spoke, Kaiser's attention sharpened. When she sat down, he seemed to relax slightly, as if her safety was his primary concern. Most telling of all, when Briggs tried to redirect the dog's attention with commands or treats, Kaiser complied reluctantly, his eyes always drifting back to the young woman who had somehow captured his complete focus. The courthouse parking lot that evening was buzzing with conversation as people made their way to their cars. The day's testimony had raised more questions than answers, and Maya's aggressive cross-examination had surprised everyone who had expected her to be overwhelmed by the legal proceedings. Officer Briggs walked slowly toward his patrol car, Kaiser trotting beside him on a shorter leash than usual. The German Shepherd had been unusually restless all afternoon, and Briggs was beginning to feel a knot of anxiety in his stomach that had nothing to do with the case itself. That's when he saw her. Maya was standing beside an old Honda Civic, loading her legal files into the back seat with the same methodical care she showed everything else. She was alone, no family members or supporters to see her off, just a 17-year-old girl carrying the weight of a felony trial on her narrow shoulders. As Briggs and Kaiser approached their patrol car, which was parked 2 spaces away, The dog suddenly pulled hard against his leash, not toward a potential threat or suspicious activity, but directly toward Maya. His tail was wagging, his body language excited and friendly, and he was making soft whining sounds that Briggs had only heard him make around people he considered family. Kaiser, heel, Briggs commanded sharply, but for the first time in their partnership the German Shepherd ignored him completely. Kaiser strained against the leash, pulling toward Maya with such determination that Briggs had to brace his feet to avoid being dragged across the parking lot. Maya looked up at the commotion, and her face brightened with genuine warmth when she saw Kaiser fighting to reach her. Without thinking, she took a step toward them, her hand extended in the universal gesture of greeting that all dog lovers recognized. Briggs said firmly, though whether he was addressing Maya or his own partner wasn't clear. "He's not a pet. He's a working dog." But even as Briggs spoke, Kaiser managed to pull hard enough to gain a few inches of slack in the leash. The German Shepherd stretched forward and managed to briefly touch Maya's outstretched fingers with his nose, a gentle, deliberate contact that spoke of recognition and trust. The moment their skin touched, something electric seemed to pass between them. Maya's eyes widened slightly, and Kaiser's tail wagged so hard his entire back end wiggled with excitement. It lasted only seconds before Briggs regained control and pulled the dog away, but those seconds were witnessed by half a dozen people in the parking lot. "That's not normal," whispered Mrs. Patterson, the court clerk who had seen hundreds of police dogs over her 20-year career. "I've never seen Kaiser react to anyone like that. It's like he knows her." As Briggs loaded Kaiser into the patrol car, the German Shepherd pressed his face against the window, watching Maya until she drove out of sight. Even then he continued to whine softly, a sound that Briggs had never heard before. The sound of a dog missing someone important that night. As Maya sat in her small apartment, reviewing the day's testimony, she found her thoughts drifting to the magnificent German Shepherd who seemed to see something in her that no one else understood. She had grown up around working dogs. Her father had been in law enforcement before his death, and she understood the bond between handler and canine, but what she had experienced with Kaiser was different. It wasn't just recognition or friendliness. It was the kind of instant connection that spoke of shared purpose, shared understanding, shared destiny, as if they were meant to work together, meant to be partners in something larger than either of them could accomplish. Alone miles away, in his own home, Officer Briggs sat in his recliner with a beer growing warm in his hand, staring at Kaiser, who lay by the front door, instead of in his usual spot by the fireplace. The German Shepherd was facing the door, his ears pricked forward, waiting for something or someone that wasn't going to come. For the first time since becoming a canine handler, Daniel Briggs began to wonder if his partner's loyalty was as absolute as he had always believed, and that thought kept him awake long into the night, staring at the ceiling and trying to figure out what a girl could possibly have that would make his dog choose her over him. By the third day of the trial, word had spread throughout Millbrook and beyond. The courthouse was packed with people who had driven from neighboring towns to witness the unprecedented, the spectacle of a teenager taking on the county's criminal justice system. Local news crews had set up cameras outside, and the parking lot was filled with vehicles bearing license plates from 3 different states. The morning began with Officer Daniel Briggs taking the witness stand, his uniform immaculate and his bearing confident. Despite the murmurs of anticipation that rippled through the gallery as the prosecution's star witness, Briggs was expected to deliver the crushing testimony that would end Maya's legal rebellion once and for all. District Attorney Richardson guided Briggs through his account with theatrical precision, painting a picture of a dedicated officer simply trying to do his job when confronted by an unruly teenager. According to Briggs's testimony, he and Kaiser had been conducting a routine patrol when they detected suspicious activity near the old warehouse district. Following proper procedure, they had investigated and discovered what appeared to be a drug transaction in progress. The defendant was clearly agitated. Briggs testified, his voice carrying the authoritative tone of someone accustomed to being believed. "Without question, she was shouting, interfering with my investigation, and when I attempted to explain the situation to her, she became increasingly hostile." Richardson nodded gravely. "And what happened when you tried to place the defendant under arrest for obstruction?" "She struck me in the chest with both hands, nearly knocking me off balance. If I hadn't been prepared for resistance, she could have seriously injured me or grabbed for my weapon." The testimony was damning, delivered with the credibility that came from 15 years of law enforcement service. Several jury members nodded along, clearly impressed by Briggs's professional demeanor and detailed account. Maya, meanwhile, sat quietly at her table, taking notes with the same methodical precision she had shown throughout the trial. But it was Kaiser's behavior that provided the most interesting subplot to the morning's proceedings. The German Shepherd sat beside the witness stand where Briggs had positioned him, but his attention was completely focused on Maya rather than his handler. Every few minutes, Kaiser would shift position slightly as if trying to get a better view of the defense table. His ears were permanently pricked forward, and his amber eyes tracked every movement Maya made with an intensity that bordered on obsession. When Richardson finished his direct examination, the courtroom buzzed with anticipation. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for, the confrontation between the experienced police officer and the teenage defendant who had somehow managed to hold her own against trained prosecutors. Maya stood slowly, gathering a thick folder from her table. As she approached the witness stand, something remarkable happened. Kaiser's tail began to wag. Not the subtle movement that had marked their previous encounters, but a clear, unmistakable expression of excitement and anticipation. The dog's entire body seemed to vibrate with energy, as if he was watching his favorite person prepare to do something extraordinary good. "Morning, Officer Briggs," Maya said pleasantly, her voice carrying none of the deference that most people showed toward law enforcement. "I'd like to clarify a few details about the night in question. If you don't mind." Briggs shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearly unsettled by Maya's confident demeanor. "Of course, you testified that you and Kaiser detected suspicious activity during a routine patrol. Is that correct?" "Yes." Maya opened her folder and withdrew a document, holding it up where the jury could see it. "This is Kaiser's training record from the State Police Academy. According to this document, Kaiser is certified in narcotics detection, tracking, and apprehension. Would you agree that he's one of the most reliable canine officers in the county?" "Absolutely. Kaiser has never given me a false alert." "Never?" Maya's eyebrows rose slightly. "That's quite remarkable. In your 15 years as his handler, Kaiser has maintained a 100% accuracy rate." Briggs hesitated, clearly sensing a trap but unable to identify it. "Well, no handler would claim absolute perfection, but Kaiser's accuracy rate is exceptional." "I see. So when Kaiser alerts to the presence of narcotics, you trust his judgment completely?" "Yes, I do." Maya smiled, and in the gallery several spectators leaned forward. They recognized the expression. It was the look of a chess player who had just maneuvered her opponent into checkmate. "Officer Briggs, do you recall Kaiser's specific behavior on the night in question? His body language, his alerts, his positioning relative to the suspected drug activity?" For the first time since taking the stand, Briggs looked genuinely uncertain. He alerted appropriately. He indicated the presence of controlled substances. "Could you be more specific? Did he sit? Did he paw at a particular location? Did he bark? What exactly did Kaiser do that night?" The courtroom fell silent as Briggs struggled to answer. His mouth opened and closed several times, but no words came out. Finally he managed. He gave his standard alert signal." Maya nodded, as if this was exactly the answer she had been expecting. "That's interesting, because I have here the incident report you filed that night." She held up another document. "In this report you describe in detail the suspect's clothing, the alleged drug transaction, the lighting conditions, and the weather. But there's no mention of Kaiser's specific behavior. Not one word about his alert signals, his positioning, or his body language. Isn't it standard procedure to document a K9's actions during a drug interdiction?" Richardson jumped to his feet. "Objection. Your Honor, the witness has already testified about his dog's behavior." "Actually," Maya said smoothly, "Officer Briggs testified that Kaiser alerted appropriately, but he hasn't described any specific behaviors. And since Kaiser's alerts form the probable cause for the entire investigation, I think the jury deserves to understand exactly what the dog did that night." Judge Hawthorne nodded. "Objection overruled. Please answer the question." Officer Briggs looked trapped, his confidence evaporating. Under Maya's relentless questioning, Kaiser indicated the presence of drugs. "That's what matters, but how did he indicate?" Maya pressed. "Did he sit and point with his nose, as he's trained to do for narcotics detection? Did he scratch at the ground, where drugs were hidden? Did he circle the suspect? What specific behavior convinced you that drugs were present?" The silence stretched on for nearly a minute as Briggs struggled to formulate an answer. During that excruciating pause, every person in the courtroom became aware of Kaiser's behavior. In the present moment, the German Shepherd was no longer sitting calmly beside the witness stand. Instead, he was standing at full attention, his eyes locked on Maya with an intensity that suggested he was waiting for something, waiting for her to give him a command. "The truth is, Officer Briggs," Maya continued, her voice gentle but implacable, "Kaiser didn't alert to drugs that night because there were no drugs to find. Isn't that correct?" "No, that's not in fact," Maya interrupted, withdrawing another document from her folder. "Kaiser's behavior that night was completely different from his normal drug detection protocol. He was alerting to something else entirely, something that you either misunderstood or chose to ignore." She walked closer to the witness stand, and Kaiser's entire body tensed with anticipation. "Kaiser wasn't signaling the presence of narcotics, Officer Briggs. He was trying to warn you about something else, something that you missed. Because you were too focused on making an arrest to listen to your partner." The courtroom erupted in whispers as Maya's implications became clear. She wasn't just questioning Briggs's testimony, she was suggesting that he had either misinterpreted or deliberately ignored his own dog's signals. But it was what happened next that stunned everyone in the courtroom into absolute silence. As Maya stood near the witness stand, Kaiser suddenly rose to his feet and took a step toward her, not aggressively, not threateningly, but with the purposeful movement of a dog responding to an unspoken command from his true handler. Briggs reached for Kaiser's leash, but the German Shepherd ignored him completely. Instead, Kaiser walked directly to Maya and sat. at perfect attention beside her, his amber eyes bright with intelligence and what could only be described as Brit. The hell, Briggs started to say, but Judge Hawthorne's gavel cut him off. Order in the court, she commanded, though her own voice carried a note of amazement. Officer Briggs, control your animal butt. That was the problem. Kaiser was completely beyond Briggs's control. Now the German Shepherd had made his choice, and he was sitting beside Maya Rodriguez as if that was where he had always belonged. Maya looked down at Kaiser, her hand instinctively moving to scratch behind his ears. The dog's tail wagged happily as he pressed his head against her leg in a gesture of absolute trust and loyalty. Her honor, Maya said quietly, her voice carrying clearly through the stunned courtroom. I believe Kaiser is trying to tell us something important, something that Officer Briggs either couldn't or wouldn't hear on the night in question. She looked directly at Briggs, who was staring at his former partner with an expression of shock and betrayal. The truth is, Officer Briggs never had probable cause for his investigation that night. Kaiser wasn't alerting to drugs, he was trying to warn about a completely different kind of danger, and when you ignored his signals and proceeded with an illegal arrest, Kaiser knew exactly what kind of officer you really were. The implications of Maya's words hit the courtroom like a thunderbolt. She wasn't just defending herself against criminal charges, she was exposing a pattern of police misconduct that had been hidden behind the unquestioned credibility of a canine's alerts. The judge called for a recess to restore order. Kaiser remained calmly seated beside Maya, his loyalty as clear and unmistakable as a flag planted on conquered territory. The bond that had been building over 3 days of testimony had finally crystallized into something that no one could deny or ignore. The teenage girl and the police dog had found each other across the artificial boundaries of a legal system that was supposed to keep them apart. And in that moment of recognition, the entire foundation of the prosecution's case began to crumble like a house built on sand. The fourth day of the trial began with an electricity in the air that everyone could feel. News of Kaiser's dramatic defection had spread like wildfire through the small town, and the courthouse was so packed that bailiffs had to turn people away at the door. Camera crews from 3 different television stations had set up outside, and reporters were interviewing anyone willing to share their opinion about the unprecedented events unfolding inside. Judge Hawthorne had spent the evening researching legal precedents, trying to find guidance for a situation that seemed to have no precedent in American jurisprudence. Could a police dog's behavior be considered testimony? What did it mean when a canine officer chose to align himself with the defendant rather than his handler? These were questions that law schools didn't prepare judges to answer. Maya arrived early, carrying an even larger stack of folders than usual. She had spent most of the night preparing for what she knew would be the most crucial day of the trial. As she arranged her materials at the defense table, she was acutely aware of the whispered conversations and pointing fingers throughout the gallery. Some people looked at her with new respect, others with suspicion, but everyone was watching. Officer Briggs entered the courtroom looking haggard and defeated. The confident swagger that had characterized his earlier appearances was gone, replaced by the uncertain gait of a man whose world was collapsing around him. Kaiser was with him, but the German Shepherd's body language told a different story than before. Instead of walking proudly beside his handler, Kaiser seemed to be scanning the courtroom, searching for someone else. The moment Kaiser spotted Maya, his entire demeanor changed. His ears shot forward, his tail began to wag, and he pulled gently against the leash in her direction. Briggs jerked the leash sharply, but the damage was already done. Everyone in the courtroom had witnessed the dog's preference once again. Attorney Richardson stood to address the court, his usual theatrical confidence noticeably subdued. Your Honor, the state would like to introduce additional evidence that we believe will clarify the events of the night in question. Maya's eyes narrowed. She had been expecting this last-ditch effort by the prosecution to salvage their case by introducing evidence that hadn't been disclosed during discovery. It was a risky move that bordered on prosecutorial misconduct, but Richardson was desperate enough to try it. What additional evidence, Mr. Richardson? Judge Hawthorne asked, her tone suggesting she was already skeptical. Richardson produced a small plastic bag containing what appeared to be a folded piece of paper. This was found in Officer Briggs's patrol car after yesterday's proceedings, Your Honor. It appears to be a note that was somehow placed there without his knowledge. Maya felt her pulse quicken, but she kept her expression neutral. She had no idea what was in that bag, but she knew it couldn't be good for her case. Your Honor, she said, rising smoothly to her feet. This is the first time the defense has heard about this alleged evidence. I object to its introduction without proper discovery. Sustained. Judge Hawthorne said firmly, Mr. Richardson, you know better than to spring evidence on the defense at trial. But Richardson wasn't finished. Your Honor, we believe this evidence directly relates to the defendant's ability to influence police animals. Given yesterday's unusual events, we feel the jury has a right to understand the full scope of the defendant's capabilities. Maya realized with crystalline clarity that this was the moment everything would be decided. Richardson was trying to paint her as some kind of dog whisperer or con artist who had somehow manipulated Kaiser for her own purposes. If the jury bought that narrative, her entire defense would crumble, Your Honor, Maya said, her voice carrying a note of steel that made several spectators sit up straighter. I have a counterproposal. Rather than introducing mystery evidence at the last minute, why don't we let Kaiser demonstrate what really happened that night? The courtroom erupted in surprised murmurs. Judge Hawthorne banged her gavel for order, but her own expression showed intrigue mixed with concern. What exactly are you proposing, Ms. Rodriguez? Maya looked directly at Kaiser, who was sitting beside Briggs but watching her with intense focus. I'm requesting permission to demonstrate Kaiser's actual training and capabilities, not the version that's been presented by the prosecution, but what he's really trained to detect and respond to. Richardson jumped to his feet. Objection. This is highly irregular and potentially dangerous, more dangerous than convicting an innocent person based on false testimony. Maya shot back, Your Honor, Kaiser is the only witness who was present during the alleged crime who cannot be influenced by personal bias or ulterior motives. His behavior yesterday suggests he has something important to tell this court. Judge Hawthorne considered for a long moment, clearly wrestling with a decision that could set legal precedent. Finally, she nodded. I'll allow a limited demonstration, but only under strict controlled conditions. Maya felt a surge of triumph mixed with terror. She was about to stake everything on her understanding of Kaiser's true capabilities and her growing certainty that there was far more to this case than anyone realized. Thank you, Your Honor, Maya said, moving toward the center of the courtroom. Before we begin, I'd like to establish something for the record. Officer Briggs, you've testified that Kaiser is trained in narcotics detection, correct? Briggs nodded reluctantly. Yes, and tracking. Yes, what about detection of other substances? Explosives, perhaps, or electronic devices? Briggs hesitated, clearly unsure where this was leading. Kaiser has some cross-training in explosive detection. Yes, Maya smiled, and several jury members recognized the expression that had preceded her previous breakthroughs. What about evidence tampering, Officer Briggs? Is Kaiser trained to detect when someone has handled evidence with latex gloves, or when substances have been planted rather than naturally occurring? What do you mean? I mean, Maya said, her voice growing stronger with each word, is Kaiser trained to distinguish between genuine crime scenes and fabricated ones? The courtroom fell silent as the implications of her question sank, and Richardson was on his feet immediately. But Judge Hawthorne waved him down. He'll allow the question, Officer Briggs. Please answer. Kaiser is a drug detection dog, Briggs said weakly. He alerts to the presence of controlled substances. That's not what I asked, Maya pressed. I asked whether he can detect evidence tampering, because that's what he was trying to tell you. That night, wasn't it? He wasn't alerting to drugs, he was alerting to the fact that someone had planted evidence. Maya turned to address the jury directly. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm about to prove to you that Kaiser's behavior that night and his behavior in this courtroom has nothing to do with drug detection and everything to do with justice detection. He's been trying to tell everyone the truth about what really happened, but no one has been listening to the right witness. She walked over to where Kaiser sat beside Briggs, and the German Shepherd immediately rose to his feet, his tail wagging with anticipation. Your Honor, with your permission, I'd like to conduct a simple test. Officer Briggs testified that he found drugs at the scene. I'd like Kaiser to demonstrate his reaction to the evidence bag that was supposedly collected that night. Judge Hawthorne looked uncertain but curious. How do you propose to do this safely? Maya reached into her jacket and pulled out a small evidence bag, the same type used by law enforcement. This bag contains a substance that Officer Briggs claimed was found at the scene. If Kaiser is truly a reliable narcotics detection dog, he should alert to its presence immediately. She held the bag at shoulder height, well within Kaiser's range of detection. The entire courtroom held its breath as they waited for the dog's reaction. Kaiser looked at the bag, sniffed once, and then did something that shocked everyone present. Instead of alerting to the presence of drugs, he turned his back on the evidence bag completely and walked directly to Maya's defense table. There he began to paw gently at her briefcase, whining softly in a tone that conveyed urgency rather than excitement. What is he doing? Judge Hawthorne asked. Maya's heart was racing as she realized what Kaiser was trying to show them. She opened her briefcase and withdrew a manila folder that she hadn't planned to use until much later in her defense. He's showing you the real evidence, Your Honor, the evidence that proves Officer Briggs planted drugs at the scene and then lied about it under oath. The courtroom erupted in gasps and shouted objections, but Maya continued over the chaos. Kaiser has been trained not just to detect drugs but to detect deception. He can smell the difference between evidence that belongs at a crime scene and evidence that has been artificially placed there. That's why he's been gravitating toward me. He knows I have the proof of what really happened. She opened the folder and withdrew a series of photographs. These pictures were taken by a security camera at the warehouse where the alleged drug transaction occurred. They show Officer Briggs at the scene 2 hours before he claimed to discover the suspicious activity. Maya held up the first photograph, which clearly showed Briggs's patrol car parked behind the warehouse. And this one shows him placing a small object, the same object he later discovered during his the location where he would claim to find drugs. The second photograph was even more damning, showing Briggs in civilian clothes rather than his uniform, suggesting he had visited the scene while off duty. Your Honor, Maya continued, her voice rising above the chaos in the courtroom. Officer Briggs didn't stumble across a drug transaction that night, he created one. He planted evidence, fabricated probable cause, and then arrested me when I witnessed his illegal activity and tried to document it. She turned to face Briggs directly, and Kaiser immediately moved to position himself between them. Not aggressively, but protectively, as if he understood that his real job was to protect the innocent from those who would abuse their authority. That's why Kaiser has been reacting to me the way he has. Maya explained. He's not confused or manipulated. He's doing exactly what he was trained to do. He's identifying the person who represents justice in this courtroom, and it's not his handler. Briggs looked like a man watching his entire world collapse in real time. His face had gone pale, and his hands were shaking as he reached for Kaiser's leash, but the German Shepherd smoothly evaded his grasp and sat down beside Maya, his amber eyes bright with what could only be described as satisfaction. Richardson was shouting objections and demanding to examine the photographs, but Judge Hawthorne was studying the evidence with the intense focus of someone who recognized a pivotal moment when she saw it. Mr. Richardson, she said quietly, her voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. I suggest you look very carefully at these photographs before you continue your objections, because if they show what Ms. Rodriguez claims they show, we're looking at criminal charges against your star witnesses. Richardson examined the evidence with growing horror. Maya knelt down beside Kaiser and scratched behind his ears. The German Shepherd's tail wagged happily as he pressed his head against her shoulder in a gesture of absolute trust. Good boy, she whispered so softly that only he could hear. I knew you were trying to tell the truth. I just had to figure out how to listen. The demonstration had lasted less than 10 minutes, but it had fundamentally altered the trajectory of the trial. A teenage girl had just used a police dog's instincts to expose corruption that had been hidden behind badges and official reports. And Kaiser finally, free to show his true loyalty, had chosen justice over the blind obedience that had made him an unwitting accomplice to deception. The wall between truth and lies had been broken, and the pieces were scattered across the courthouse floor for everyone to see. The jury deliberated for exactly 47 minutes, barely enough time to elect a foreman and review the evidence that had turned the entire case upside down. When the bailiff announced their return, the packed courtroom fell into a silence so complete that the mechanical hum of the air conditioning system sounded like a Romaya Rodriguez sat at the defense table with Kaiser lying calmly at her feet, his head resting on his paws but his amber eyes alert and watchful. The German Shepherd's presence had become so natural over the past day that several people had to remind themselves that technically he still belonged to the police department, but ownership, as everyone in the courtroom had learned, was a far more complex concept than simple paperwork. Suggested Officer Daniel Briggs sat in the gallery, now no longer a witness but a spectator to his own professional destruction. The photographs Maya had presented had been authenticated by digital forensics experts, and their times told a story that even the most creative defense attorney couldn't explain away. Internal Affairs had launched an immediate investigation, and federal authorities were reviewing every case Briggs had been involved with over the past 5 years. Judge Hawthorne looked tired but determined as she addressed the jury foreman. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, have you reached a verdict? We have, Your Honor. The foreman, a retired teacher named Margaret Walsh, stood with a piece of paper in her hands. That would determine Maya's fate. On the charge of reckless endangerment, we find the defendant not guilty. A murmur of approval rippled through the gallery, but Maya remained perfectly still, her hand resting gently on Kaiser's neck. On the charge of obstruction of justice, we find the defendant not guilty. The murmurs grew louder, and several spectators began to applaud before Judge Hawthorne's stern look restored order. And on the charge of assault on a police officer, we find the defendant not guilty. The courtroom erupted in cheers and applause that Judge Hawthorne didn't even attempt to suppress. Maya closed her eyes and let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding while Kaiser's tail began to wag with what appeared to be his own understanding of victory. But the drama was far from over as the celebration continued. Around them, Judge Hawthorne raised her hand for silence. Before this court is adjourned, there are several matters that need to be addressed. She fixed her gaze on the prosecution table, where District Attorney Richardson sat, looking like he wished he could disappear entirely. Mr. Richardson, given the evidence presented during this trial, I am ordering an immediate investigation into the conduct of Officer Briggs and potentially other members of your office who may have been involved in prosecutorial misconduct. Richardson nodded miserably, already calculating the political damage this case would inflict on his career. Furthermore, Judge Hawthorne continued, I am issuing a court order for the immediate review of all cases involving Officer Briggs and his canine partner over the past 5 years. Any convictions based solely on Kaiser's alerts will be subject to appeal, and potential implications were staggering: dozens of cases, hundreds of arrests, millions of dollars in seized assets, all potentially tainted by the corrupt practices of one officer. who had exploited his dog's reputation for personal gain, but it was Judge Hawthorne's final announcement that surprised everyone. Most of all, there remains the question of Kaiser's future status according to police department regulations. A K-9 officer who fails to obey his handler's commands is subject to retirement or reassignment. However, the evidence presented in this case suggests that Kaiser was not failing to follow orders, he was following higher orders. The order to serve justice rather than corruption. Maya looked up sharply, suddenly understanding where this was heading up. Briggs. Judge Hawthorne called out, "Please approach the bench." Briggs walked forward slowly, his face a mask of shame and defeat. When he reached the judge's bench, she spoke quietly enough that only he could hear, but her words carried the weight of absolute authority. "You have disgraced your badge, your department, and most importantly, you have betrayed the trust of a partner who was trying to help you do the right thing under the circumstances. I think it would be appropriate for you to make one final decision that puts someone else's needs above your own." Briggs stood silently for a long moment, his eyes fixed on Kaiser, who was watching the exchange with intelligent attention. Finally, he nodded and walked over to where Maya sat at the defense table. The courtroom fell silent as Briggs knelt down beside Kaiser and slowly removed the dog's police collar and leash. His hands were shaking as he placed them on the table in front of Maya, his voice barely audible when he spoke. "He's better off with you," he said quietly, his words carrying the weight of complete defeat. "He always knew what kind of person you were, even when I couldn't see it myself." Maya's eyes filled with tears as she looked down at Kaiser, who had risen to sit beside her chair. With perfect military posture, the German Shepherd's tail wagged once slowly and deliberately, as if he understood that this moment marked the beginning of a new chapter in his life. "Are you sure?" Maya asked softly, though her hand was already moving to stroke Kaiser's magnificent head. Briggs nodded, unable to meet her eyes. "He chose you from the first day. I was just too proud and too stupid to accept what everyone else could see." Hawthorne watched the exchange with something approaching wonder. In 30 years, on the bench, she had never witnessed anything like the bond between this teenage girl and the police dog, who had recognized her integrity when the entire legal system had failed to do so. "Ms. Rodriguez," she said formally, "are you prepared to take responsibility for Kaiser's care and well-being?" Maya looked down at Kaiser, who was watching her with complete trust and devotion. "Yes, Your Honor. I am then, by the authority vested in me by the state of Michigan, I hereby transfer custody of Kaiser to Maya Rodriguez, with all rights and responsibilities that such custody entails." As the gavel came down with finality, the courtroom erupted in applause that lasted nearly 5 minutes. Maya knelt down and wrapped her arms around Kaiser's neck, feeling his strength and warmth and loyalty flowing into her like a transfusion of hope. Outside the courthouse, an hour later, Maya walked slowly down the stone steps with Kaiser trotting proudly beside her. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the courthouse lawn, and the air was filled with the sounds of reporters shouting questions and cameras clicking rapidly, but Maya heard none of it. Her attention was focused entirely on the magnificent German Shepherd who had seen through all the lies and legal maneuvering to recognize the truth that mattered most. She was innocent, she was worthy of loyalty, and she was exactly the kind of person who deserved a second chances. They reached the sidewalk. Kaiser suddenly stopped and looked back at the courthouse. Last time Maya followed his gaze and saw Officer Briggs standing in the doorway, watching them with an expression of profound sadness, mixed with something that might have been relief. Maya raised her hand in a small wave, not forgiveness exactly, but acknowledgement that even in his failure, Briggs had made one right choice. He had let Kaiser go to where he belonged in. She and Kaiser turned toward the future, walking side by side down the tree-lined street. As the sun began to set behind them, they had survived the trial by fire, proved their worth to each other and to the world, and emerged stronger for having faced their challenges. Together, Maya Rodriguez was no longer just a teenager who had been wrongly accused. She was Kaiser's partner, his handler, his human, and Kaiser was no longer just a police dog following orders he didn't understand. He was Maya's protector, her companion, her living reminder that justice and loyalty were not just concepts in law books, but forces that could change the world when wielded by those brave enough to stand up for what was right. As they walked into their new life together, Kaiser's tail wagged with the confidence of a dog who had finally found his true purpose, and Maya smiled with the satisfaction of someone who had not only cleared her name but had gained a partner whose loyalty was worth more than any legal victory could ever be. Behind them, the courthouse stood as a monument to the day when a teenage girl and a police dog had proven that sometimes the most important truths can only be understood by those who are willing to listen with their hearts instead of their heads. The case was closed, but their partnership was just beginning. This story explores themes of truth, loyalty, and the unique bond between humans and working dogs through the lens of a legal drama set in a small-town courthouse. It examines how courage can emerge from unexpected places, how justice sometimes requires breaking conventional rules, and how the most profound partnerships can form between unlikely allies who recognize each other's true character despite societal barriers and assumptions.